Thank you very much, Professor Arun. Thanks. I remember taking Owen Fiss's civil procedure class in this very room, and so learning all about how to use the law to do good, speaking in this room brings back fond memories. So what I want to talk about is a project I'm working on called the National Security Internet. In 1964, we began with a national security approach to the internet. The internet was created, in fact, to serve national security interests. Okay? Why? Because we wanted to create communication systems that would be resilient in the face of nuclear attack. Okay, so this is one of the first kind of pioneering works here, Paul Baran's paper prepared for the RAND Corporation, which talks about distribution, creating a highly survivable system, even in the event of thermonuclear war. Okay, so national security has always hovered somewhere in the space of the internet. But the solution that we chose was a distributed solution. The response to the national security concern was this kind of radically distributed system, okay, where there was no central node of power. And in fact, you don't see national borders even in this network. Okay, so the response to the national security problem in the 1960s and what led to the packet switch network that we have today was a highly distributed network that didn't have centralization or power built into it. Okay, but what I'm arguing in my paper is that we're seeing the return of security spaces under more traditional digital walls, digital borders being erected now. So you recall in 2020, so let me connect a few dots, borrowing the analogy from the previous slide. So in 2020, you will recall the kind of announcement that in 45 days, TikTok would have to be sold or shuttered by Trump. This is yesterday's news, House to move ahead with bill targeting TikTok, even as Trump flip-flops on his view, which is kind of an interesting suggestion. Trump says, if you get rid of TikTok, you only help Facebook, which he abhors more than TikTok, apparently. By the way, you're maybe skeptical about, I see some skepticism about helping Facebook. Clearly, it would help. It's a huge, Facebook has been pushing for a TikTok ban behind the scenes. This is a huge, would be a huge fillip to Facebook if TikTok were banned in the United States. But I want to connect the dots further to a couple other stories from this week's papers. This is the front page of the Wall Street Journal yesterday. China intensifies, this may be over the weekend. China intensifies push to delete America from its technology. Okay, so what I want to say, just, to pull the lens, the aperture wider, is to say this is not just an American phenomenon. This is a phenomenon occurring across the world, especially in very large places with kind of very significant geopolitical concerns. Then this tiny little story that didn't get much attention. Espionage probe finds communications devices on Chinese cranes at U.S. ports. Okay, a kind of now the Biden administration devoting now $20 billion to ripping and replacing Chinese cranes in the U.S. Okay, This is serious money. It's not, Chinese cranes are by far the cheapest cranes available. And so now our ports will, in the future, try to adopt less Chinese built cranes. And then a story that you may not have followed yesterday, but an announcement yesterday from the European Data Protection Supervisor that the European Commission can't use Office 365, Microsoft 365. Okay. Why? Again, because of transfers of personal data outside the European Union. Okay. All these are connected. The story in all of these is data taken from one jurisdiction being transferred to another jurisdiction that we are concerned about, the concern being that foreign intelligence services in that second jurisdiction will be gathering the data. Okay, for the U.S., it has been the concern that China might be gathering the data. For China, it's been the concern that the United States might be gathering the data, and for the European Union, it's the concern again that the United States and actually other countries as well might be gathering the data. So literally, to be very specific about this, because many of you are familiar with the transatlantic data privacy framework, which makes it possible for data to flow to the United States under an adequacy ruling. So the focus is on countries that don't have adequacy. There are only about a dozen countries that have an adequacy ruling, half of which are Caribbean islands, which are kind of former colonies of the European Union. And so very few countries have an adequacy ruling, the US having reobtained one recently in the wake of the Schrems II decision after a number of years of negotiation. The particular concern in this context is likely to be the use of Indian subcontractors in the process of troubleshooting, et cetera, Microsoft cloud services. Okay, it's very hard to know. We don't know the exact details, but the concern isn't transfers to the United States because you have a data privacy framework already establishing that as a legitimate. Now the concern is all the other countries that don't have adequacy that might receive European data through Office Cloud. And so you have lots of vendors that use back offices in India in particular, or in any other jurisdiction that has these back office services. Okay. So now the Great Firewall of China has gone global as countries erect barriers to data flow across borders. And this has enormous consequences for global opportunities that the internet offered. In the US, we see the bipartisan effort to ban TikTok. In China, we see the beginning of an effort to, quote, delete America. Okay. So as the TikTok ban is going on in Congress and races to completion perhaps soon, the response from China is nowhere to be in mind among American thinkers on the subject, but there is a response that's brewing. Okay. Some background writings quickly. The great thing about giving talks is to being able to kind of say, hey, maybe, hopefully getting your work cited. And so this is an effort to do that. So I wrote a piece kind of doing a blow-by-blow of what happened in 2020 with Trump's effort to ban TikTok, asking the question, how did a Chinese big tech company beat the president of the United States on his home turf? Okay. By 2021, it was not TikTok that had been banned by Trump, but Trump that had been banned by TikTok. Okay, so a weird turn in the United States. A paper with Paul Schwartz, Privacy and Our Trade, talking about the growing conflict between data privacy rules and trade, and a new paper in the Penn Law Review coming out later this year on the president's statutory authority over cross-border data flows, part of which I'll discuss in my comments this afternoon. So there's a descriptive claim. The world's largest economies are erecting digital barriers to each other's firms, fearing that those firms might be compelled to serve as spies for their home countries. Your crane might be ratting on you, okay? Or your TikTok usage might be ratting on you. So the Great Firewall of China is now met by the Great Firewall of the United States and the Great Firewall of Europe. And there's a normative claim, and apologies for the terrible typefaces here, but I'll read this. The normative claim, these digital border walls disrupt trade and investment, reduce competition, invite retaliation, prove impossible to, this is why I never finished the slide, it turns out. that little extra gap tells you where I was planning to having wordsmithing problems here. Prove impossible to effectuate and increase and ultimately increase government control over speech. Okay. And the normative part of the paper suggests reforms to protect both civil rights and national security. So what I want to do in the in the part of my talk to kind of sketch out the descriptive claim is tell you a little bit about the arsenal of legal tools that the US is assembling to stop data flows, talk a little bit about what is happening in China, and then finally the European Union. Okay, and the European Union's approach is different, is actually notably different, because the European Union, as you know, doesn't have national security as a regional competence at the European level. Rather, the concerns about foreign surveillance arise through the protection of fundamental rights of Europeans. So this isn't a national security concern, at least as it's currently imagined, but rather a concern about protecting the individual rights of European citizens against foreign surveillance. Okay. So in the United States, you have two statutory authorizations that are critical. One is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, better known as IEPA. I learned about IEPA in my second semester of law school here, and I have been guided by Harold's brilliant thinking in the kind of national security space ever since. Okay, so the IEPA has a critical exception that Congress built into it in the 1980s and 1990s through amendments. This is excluding, so IEPA is a broad power to the president to declare a international economic emergency, and then to kind of have broad control to respond to that emergency, including various economic actions that the president might take. But in 1988, and then again 1994, Congress insisted that that authority did not include the power to directly or indirectly regulate the flow of informational materials across borders. Okay. And so in the 1994 version of the statute is literally, of the amendment is literally called the Free Trade and Ideas Act. Okay. In the 1980s, the concern was very much in the United States, the flow of communist propaganda into the United States, and the congressional response at that time, okay, this is still with the USSR still lumbering along, was we are not afraid of foreign propaganda. Okay. And the president cannot exclude foreign propaganda from our shores. Okay. This is consistent with this wonderful case from 1960s called Lamont v. Postmaster General. I first wrote about Lamont v. Postmaster General like in 2002 or 2003. These are like, if for the scholars in the room, you'll find that you keep on referring to there's some archetypes that develop in your work and you don't know when they'll reappear. Lamont v. Postmaster General involved a case, I need to rush, sorry, involved an effort to bar or to regulate the flow of communist propaganda to the United States. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't stop information even from their communist China coming into the United States. It was literally the piece that was sought to be regulated was called the Peking Review. Okay, very much a propaganda from communist China. The second set of statutory authorizations arises out of the authorizations that create the Committee on Foreign Investment into the United States, looking at inbound investment into the United States. Okay. The critical moves, however, are occurring through a series of executive orders implementing these statutory authorizations, and then the regulations implementing the executive orders. So what I'm going to try to argue very quickly is that we're giving the president an enormous power over our information and technology systems, as long as the president declares a national or international emergency. Okay, just an enormous power that is, hidden and not very well, not subject to the light of day. Securing this 2019 executive order, securing the information and communication supply technology services supply chain, permits Commerce Secretary to ban transactions with any, I'm going to call it ICTS, information and communications technology or service, ICTS, subject to the jurisdiction or direction of a foreign adversary, in which the Commerce Secretary believes poses an unacceptable risk to national security. Okay. When Trump banned TikTok, this was the basis for the ban. Okay, this statute. Now I ask you, what part of the supply chain does TikTok sit at? And it's a trick question because it doesn't matter. The EO purports to be talking about very technical things, supply chains. The regulation itself, the order itself, applies to every ICTS. If it's digital, the president can ban it. Okay, doesn't have to be part of the supply chain or anything beyond that. Okay, so enormous powers that are being asserted under these rules. Mind you, in the shadow of an informational materials exception that is very significant. Okay, the ICTS, the informational materials exception is, of course, only for IEPA, not for CFIUS. So, the statutory exception is. Okay, I'll move on. Other EOs that fall along this line, the term that's often used is subject to the jurisdiction of. Okay, as long as you're a company subject to the jurisdiction or direction of a foreign adversary, you are suspect. Okay. CFIUS, many of you are familiar with, and so this is what has been going on with TikTok, and we'll come back to its use in TikTok later in the talk. Let's talk about China. So China's Great Firewall was largely erected in its first version 1.0, as an effort to stop data from coming into the country. We don't want foreign information from coming into the country. Okay. And so but over the last half a dozen years has been transformed into a border that says we don't want data to flow outside the country. Okay, so the Great Firewall of China has actually transformed very significantly over the last decade. So what I'm doing here is tracing similar moves with the United States and China. Okay, and you can, I haven't done this in the paper to see who got there first for various things, but there's a huge consonance of moves in these quarters. Okay. Measures for security assessment of data transfers, entities handling the personal information of over 1 million people, or the sensitive personal information of more than 10,000 people are to be subject to these data transfer concerns. And as I said, you may be familiar with Data Protection Commissioner versus Facebook, the Max Schrems 2 case. And here the concern is, because of US foreign surveillance law and the powers given to in particular the NSA, American companies are inherently suspect because they might transfer data to the United States and it might not be protected under European data protection standards. Okay, and so this has instantiated, you saw the Office 365. So again, that's the European Data Protection Supervisor telling the European Commission that they violated the GDPR. Okay, just so you know, that's what it's. Why they violated the GDPR? Because they're using Office 365. The very use of Office 365 is the problem. And so the cybersecurity certifications, as they're drafted in their draft form at least, require global headquarters in a member state. You can't be a foreign company. Okay. And what I suggest in the paper is that what we're seeing is the emergence of a kind of new doctrine that hasn't been identified before. If you look at these things, what you're seeing is a new way to understand when international commerce is welcome. And this is what I call immunity from foreign jurisdiction. Okay, you recall the language of subject to foreign jurisdiction? The obverse of that is immunity from foreign jurisdiction. What we want you to show is immunity from foreign jurisdiction. Then you're welcome here. Okay, and this occurs in all three of these jurisdictions, this kind of immunity from foreign jurisdiction. And what I define it as the requirement that an entity conducting local business not be subject to foreign sovereign compulsion. Okay, no other government, especially an adversary government, can tell you what to do. Okay, and you can already see when we start talking in those terms how radical a proposition that is. Okay, now so countries are now not only demanding that data be stored locally, data localization, of which I wrote about in a paper in 2015, published in 2015, but now that it's collected, stored, and processed by local companies not subject to foreign jurisdiction. What I describe as data localization squared, local storage by local companies. Okay, because the foreign companies are not immune to foreign jurisdiction. Okay. Now, here's the oddity of this. Even local companies with significant foreign operations might be said to be subject to foreign jurisdiction. So it becomes even hard, even for local companies, to necessarily satisfy this immunity demand. Okay, and I can contrast it with for the transnational litigation folks. There's more distinctions. Now here, let me now quickly turn to the normative, and I'll So reduces competition, that's obvious. You knock out all the foreign players. You might even knock out large domestic players along the way, okay? Second, it's expensive. Knocking out competition often raises the expense, but it's expensive to operate and to comply with. Third, it invites retaliation. I'll talk about that shortly. It's ineffective. There's the typical ways that surveillance authorities work is through hacking, spying, and buying. Okay, so surveillance authorities use lots of illicit means to gather data. They don't rely upon the law. It's highly intrusive because it requires, you now not only have to check, are you sending data abroad, you now actually have to vet all your employees to see who have access to data to make sure that they don't have any foreign connections that might subject them to foreign compulsion. And it increases government control. And that's so it increases government control. Okay, now hacking, well, half of the data on half of the population of France was hacked from health insurers in France last month, okay? This was data stored by French companies, presumably somewhere locally. We don't know where. The fact that you are a local company storing data locally doesn't immunize you from foreign hacking, okay? And retaliation, just some quick glimpses in this. This is Apple's 2023 annual report. It reports net sales by reportable segment. Greater China, $72.5 billion in sales, making up almost 20% of Apple's total sales for the year. Okay. So if you ask me the company I would be, if I were advising on investing after the TikTok ban, I would, short Apple. And so, that would be what I would, there's going to be enormous blowback. And already you've seen a decline of 9% of Apple's share price over the last few months as concerns about Apple have increased. What's the theory? Well, if you can't trust TikTok because it might be gathering data on you, well, how can you trust your damn smartphone, which certainly is gathering all kinds of data on you? Okay, the whole smartphone is gathering just enormous quantities of data. But now you can go to Microsoft, which has to operate. Microsoft never left China. You can Bing as much as you wanted in China. And so just, the whole story of ethical enterprises versus unethical enterprises, fascinating to see what the public perceptions are. Apple, allows you to do search in China, et cetera, and localizes data in China. So tons of companies. Tesla is another company that is going to see possibly significant headwinds in China as well. Okay, so retaliation being significantly important. Now, I said another thing, which is that it increases government control, right? Let me give you an example. The US government's concerns regarding TikTok, and I'm here using the filings they have made over the years in defending their TikTok ban in courts. Chinese government's authority and supervision over nominally private organizations, Chinese laws that require a private person to assist Chinese intelligence services, Chinese rules that give the government the power to take control over organization facilities, including communications equipment. China might compel TikTok to push communist propaganda to US residents. Okay, all of those concerns, which I think are serious concerns. Now, here's TikTok's response after years of negotiating with CFIUS, okay? Under the draft agreement, CFIUS is a secretive organization. We don't see any reasoned decisions. We only hear reporting about what CFIUS does. This is not subject to public scrutiny. in any way whatsoever. But some reporting on this under the draft agreement with CFIUS, which TikTok is labeled Project Texas to sound as American as possible. Under the draft agreement, US government agencies like DOJ or DOD would have the authority to examine TikTok's servers with no notice, could demand that ByteDance promptly alter its source code, and has a board of directors that is literally approved by the US government. Okay, this is the Washington Post describing it. A sweeping plan ByteDance introduced under which Chinese company would cede authority over TikTok's US operations to a 3-person board whose members CFIUS would essentially select. Okay, now I want you to go back to this. Complaints about China, and then the powers that the US asserted in this context. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance, which is really striking between our concerns about China and what the US has asserted. So again, the worry about this. Here's a funny anecdote in the context. In the negotiations with CFIUS, ByteDance and TikTok's, so one of the reporters got a copy of a draft agreement, which was blacklined by the various lawyers, okay, showing the changes one side or other was asking, and in this case, ByteDance, TikTok's lawyers. ByteDance and TikTok sought to modify the agreement to prevent the US government from demanding changes to TikTok's algorithm simply because it recommended content that the government does not like. So you have the very odd spectacle of a Chinese-owned company negotiating on behalf of US users to protect their rights, their civil liberties. Okay. There's something very awkward in this whole process. Okay, solutions very quickly, and I'll stop and this is the last slide. Disclosure, telling people where their data is flowing, obviously not a very good solution, but one that the ADPPA, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, the bipartisan bill with the greatest support in Congress, has a disclosure of data flows to China in it. Just FYI. Privacy law, which I think is an important part of the story. Small yard, big fence approach, which has been discussed generally with respect vis-a-vis China. That is, identify a few things that we really want to protect and are very sensitive, and make sure those are well protected. And what I really focus on in the paper, and is going to be part of my work over the summer, is legal constraints on foreign surveillance. How can countries themselves take on constraints on their surveillance abroad? So the classic example would be FISA reform, and even the transatlantic data privacy framework would be examples of that. And trying to figure out what kind of constraints could the United States take on, what kind of constraints could China take on to make their companies and their intelligence services less of a threat. Mind you, this is all focused still on the formal law, because so much of this operates at the formal law level, okay? Go back to everything I was saying before. It's the possibility that things might be hoovered up under the formal law. So you have to have a response under the formal law. I'm very much a realist, but here I'm responding at the level the complaints have been offered. And ultimately a no mass spying treaty, which seems impossible and improbable to many of you. But the Snowden revelations showed that the US had hacked, at least claims, I want to take every Snowden revelation, we don't really know what the truth is, but showed hacking of Chinese networks galore by the NSA, including Tsinghua's network. So imagine Yale University's network being hacked by Chinese surveillance. Okay, so lots of countries that might be concerned, so even China might be concerned with US hacking U.S. Certainly being concerned with Chinese hacking. We've got ample evidence of Chinese hacking into the United States. Okay, so I'll stop there and take your questions. Hi, Suresh.
Thanks for the interesting presentation. But you did touch upon something earlier on where you mentioned India and said that, well, despite all the rules, regulations, and laws, eventually it's likely, there's a strong likelihood that code will probably be reworked in some third country, such as, for instance, India. Now, have you looked at any developments in India with regards to data protection? I know that so far it's by and large been bilateral agreements. So I'm just wondering how this will all pan out.
Well,
it doesn't have to be India; it can be Philippines.
Right. Absolutely. So I've long been writing about the way that the internet allows for business processes to be done across the world, right? The radical splintering of business functions and the possibility of that it enables for people in certain jurisdictions to participate in much more economically remunerative transactions. And business process outsourcing being a significant component of that. What this does, and I've been calling an alarm to this for a number of years now, is that you've got a variety of frameworks that are actually pushing to make this increasingly difficult. So just as Canada might say, hey, you can't send stuff to the United States because of national surveillance authorities in the United States, which I understand. You've got countries saying you can't send stuff to all the other countries because of data privacy law being inadequate or national surveillance authorities being too great. And I think India has modified its data privacy framework significantly, but it hasn't modified its surveillance framework, and that's where if you look at Schrems 2, India would have a difficulty achieving. Mind you, I want to say this: the European Union does allow for data flows to Israel, which is adequate. And Israel has a very extensive surveillance apparatus, so the whole system of European adequacy assessment is, I have argued, highly political. And so that doesn't mean that we don't need proper surveillance constraints everywhere. But the system as it currently is erected is problematic. And it again often functions at a very formal level, which is, could this data be possibly moved from X to intelligence service, not on the practical concerns in these contexts. So it can be the most, Sephora can be charged with sending data to other places. So it's the most, and you can tell a national security story for all data. So don't get me wrong. But this is all your SurveyMonkey, et cetera. All these things have been charged in Europe as being violating European data privacy rules for data transfers. So I think that India, unfortunately, has not revised its national security, national intelligence framework, and India, focused very much on national security. India is a heavily national security state, and so India experienced terror attacks on the parliament. I mean, the Americans in the room probably are unaware of these things, but India experienced very significant terror attacks, including in Bombay, including at the hotel I stayed at in Bombay this last in January, and so responded with, like countries do with excessive, powers to their surveillance and an unwillingness to reduce those powers. And so the same Patriot Act problem that we had in the United States is a consistent theme across the world, I think. Oh, sorry. Maybe Chinmay, I'll let you. Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. What is a foreign adversary? Is there some sort of statutory definition, or is it by declaration?
So there's a statutory definition in the new TikTok bill. There's a reference to another declaration, another congressional statute, and if I recall, it's Iran, Russia, of course, China, and I think North Korea. And I don't think that Cuba and Syria are there in that list, but they're probably not that relevant to that question. So it's really, for all practical purposes, Russia and China. But I might point out, in all the TikTok concerns, Telegram is very popular in various communities in the United States. It's actually a real messaging app, unlike TikTok, which isn't designed fundamentally as a messaging app. You can use it for those purposes. But Telegram has very obscure roots and very, very untransparent operations, to say the least. Yes. Oh, sorry, I'll come to you.
Thank you so much for being here. My question is, how efficacious is any formal law response that doesn't include like a European Union style, like direct control of data flows? Because it seems to me like Meta is like perfectly capable of selling China our data through like a dozen brokerage firms as like bite dances of just giving it from. So like if you're not like controlling, if you're not like, EU says like data can't leave our borders, US also have to say like Meta, you can't be like selling.
So
like we're shutting down like this.
To the Biden administration's credit, about 10 days ago, the Biden administration did announce efforts towards rulemaking that will go to ban brokerage sales, large brokerage sales of data, which I think is a really very useful thing to do. So I'm actually in favor of that important move. So I think that's important. Of course, the data privacy law would have done that, would have already done that. So I think you're totally right that data privacy is a critical part of this. And if you look at the European style rules that have been adopted across the world, the breaks on cross-border data flows end up being in those rules because of concerns that the data could flow to foreign jurisdictions that don't have those protections. Now, whether those protections can be done by contractual obligations is another possibility. And even under the European scheme, it does allow that. The Schrems rulings have made surveillance so the reason that Europe isn't sending data abroad is not because of failure of foreign data privacy laws. It's because of the excesses of foreign surveillance laws. So even if the United States adopts a national privacy law, it doesn't do anything to change the Schrems framework. And so just like India's adoption of a comprehensive data privacy framework doesn't do anything to shift the Schrems analysis. But so I think you're totally right that it does require these kinds of intrusions on border flows to be part of the story. And as you point out, the possibility of buying data from various companies, including data brokers. So there's just a host of the classic one I point to is your weather app, which knows where you are at all times. So every app can be seen as a national security threat. That's why the cranes thing is very interesting. They had communications devices that it looks like the normal devices that you might have so that you can monitor the operations of the crane, you can troubleshoot these things, now have been recast as China is trying to examine US economic operations, and therefore, cranes now have to be sold to other unsuspecting jurisdictions. These aren't even operational, the particular devices, but they weren't in the specified in the contract to be installed. So anyway, yeah. So, but you can once you start going down this national security route. So the overall tenor of my paper really is, we could have built an internet that was designed for national security ground up, okay? In fact, China and Russia have at times tried to do that, okay? Which is, for example, you built in identity systems into the framework of the internet, okay? That really helps with your intelligence and your protecting national security, because now you know, or many people who might be using, I mean, obviously there's ways to avoid anything, but you know who's most people who are using your system. My worry is that if we transform the internet dramatically for national security purposes, we sacrifice a lot of freedoms in that process. So that's the central argument, the normative argument in my paper. Mikey, sorry, you've been waiting patiently. Sorry.
Thank you so much. This is great. So I hope I'm not like misinterpreting at all, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about this sort of the irony you pointed out of TikTok sort of arguing for U.S. civil liberties protections. Now, so isn't there a more cynical read on that, which is that yes, they will agree to changes to source code, all these sort of like infrastructural things that will do nothing to disrupt their core business model, but that somehow the recommended content thing kind of gets at the core of what they are. So it's maybe more of a cynical ploy, or like appeal to certain kinds of standards. Just want to hear you riff on this a little bit.
Yeah. So I heard Shou Chu actually talk about Project Texas, and it was so in a small little meeting, and I was stunned at how it places TikTok as kind of, there is no other entity arguing for American civil liberties in this conversation. Okay, you've got CFIUS on one side saying, we want this, we want that, we want this for national security. And all of those things that it wants for national security, totally reasonable, right? From a national security perspective. We want to know exactly what's going on, we want to come in whenever we want, grab whatever we want to be able to tell you to change anything. We want all those powers all the time. We want to choose who runs these things. You can totally see that, right? But that's when you have national security running the show. And this is why, we as people who are concerned about national security, which I certainly am, I want to live in a safe place. I don't want to cede my all decision-making to obscure national security services. And then that places TikTok in this weird role. And so the TikTok people, other than Shou Chu at this table, are all American. Many with I'm ex-Secret Service. I'm, my husband's Navy. Blah blah blah. This is what you hear in that room, right? So all these people with incredible national security connections, okay, are running the show, trying to demonstrate to the national security services that they're not scary. Okay, and so this is the people who are running the show in this context, which is kind of a weird thing. Clearly, look, would they give up our civil liberties in order to protect themselves? In a heartbeat. Now, and is this little contractual exception, but not to promote the government's own views, is that dressing? Sure, because it's totally ineffective, right? How do you enforce that? I teach contracts. What does that even mean? But it's just a funny oddity of this whole thing, right? And this is when, these things are transformed into these weird places where it's a supply chain that's an issue, not the most massive popular social media app in the country, which is the way that, lots of people communicate ordinary things. And so yeah, just kind of raising alarms about the kind of authorities that are being asserted in these obscure spaces. Yes.
Thank you, it's very interesting. And I actually have a question about other considerations, because you keep talking about the consideration of national security. But actually for the government, I think there's also the consideration of developing markets. And the consideration of national security may drive to the centralize of the control, but for the consideration of developing markets, maybe it will lead to the trend of decentralized. For example, I think last year, or maybe 2 years ago, the Chinese government also had a regulation that encourages the data flow across the border. So I think maybe for the consideration of the developing economy, so the data flow phenomenon may not be so serious. So at the same time,
So I totally hear you. Okay, so what? And what was your name? What was your name?
Yuping.
Unping.
Yuping.
Uping. Uping. You're right that so China has had a very significant data localization mandate in place for the last handful of years. No one's known what it's meant, and everyone has been waiting to see how will it be interpreted. Okay, so it says basically, hey, if you've got a lot of data, I showed you some examples of the rules. You got to check before they go out. Okay, now very recently it said most of the stuff can go out. Don't worry, it's okay. Okay, it's tried to give more comfort to everyone else. Why? Because stopping data flows is very expensive for your own economy. Okay, so this is actually so when Europe says you can't use Office 365, well, now what do you do? You need to find some alternative. Okay, either Microsoft now gets rid of all contractors or vendors. So you not have to get rid of contractors, you get rid of all vendors that are hailing from outside adequacy countries. Remember I said half a dozen real countries are there? Okay, so you now very sharply circumscribe who can provide services. Boy, it's nice not to have competition, which allows you to raise prices, right? So all this is very expensive for the local economy, and it's done in the service of national security when it's done in the service of a very formal view of national security. Not even a question of what exactly it is that's at risk, what the real estimates of that risk are, et cetera. How much of that surveillance is actually occurring? Is there evidence? So TikTok has said repeatedly, the Chinese government has never asked us for any information. Okay, and none of the stories ever say that the Chinese government has extracted information from TikTok through the TikTok authorities. I'm sure there's hacking going on all the time, and there's propaganda. So one of the things I say in the paper is that if you're worried about propaganda, 2016 should have shown us you don't need to own Facebook to own Facebook. And so there's lots of ways that you can do propaganda on all these services. Is Musk Musk, is he subject to foreign jurisdiction? But Tesla makes an enormous amount of money in China. Tesla also produces an enormous number of cars that it exports from China. Again, not just to sell it to the Chinese market, but also to export. Musk is also under pressure from China. There was an employee within Twitter, this is pre-Musk, who was convicted of being a foreign spy, and so in US court. So all of this is going on in ways that I think should make us nervous about all of it, but makes me nervous when we start kind of singling out particular companies, et cetera, as dangerous. it's hard to see where a TikTok ban stops. And the other thing that the US government really doesn't seem to be focused on at all is that like I said before, if you ban TikTok because it's dangerous, then why doesn't China ban the whole technology stack from the United States? Which is what that delete America, okay, is getting to. And this is only just starting hints at the margin. But that would, so people assume, have this view that China kicked out American tech companies. The most visible ones that are sending information services like search, not Bing search, but Google search, and Google left on its own because it was being heavily censored and it was being throttled within China. Facebook was kicked out, Wikipedia, New York Times, those things were, Twitter is kicked out, all those kinds of information services. But other American tech companies are very much in China. And so if you aren't doing a kind of traditional information service, which might affect public opinion, you typically haven't been excluded from the Chinese market. So there's lots. So the possibilities of retaliation are very significant. So that's the reality. And so China has created something called the unreliable entities list, which will label American companies, it could be foreign companies, I should say, as unreliable partners and therefore not welcome to provide services in China. And that's going to be, and you see a lot of American companies, including the chip space, pushing back against not exporting to China. So that's good. The whole hardware space is a fascinating different space to look at as well. But as I said, my story has huge implications for the hardware space, because the cranes, which are really, the value added in the crane is very much in the physical good, but they're being ripped out because of the communication that might be possible. Okay, so it's really, and that's a $20 billion hit to the US taxpayer, right? With no one paying any attention. Is that justified? I myself am skeptical. So, and not just the hit to the American tax, it raises the cost of building ports, processing our goods, the whole thing. It just, raises costs dramatically. So it becomes a tax on the economy in a very interesting way, but partly because of the politics of the U.S., which is to show that we're not subject to Chinese. Each party wants to insulate itself from the charge that it is soft on China, that it's kind of allowing for China to exploit America in particular ways.
Getting you to your interview. I'm so sorry, but Anupam has an interview. You can see his media appearances. You will be on T1 for this. Thank you so much for making time for us. I hope that I am not stretching it when I say that we're looking forward to the next time you visit, because we will keep inviting you. This is actually an extraordinarily representative group of people from almost all the continents here. And
Okay. All right.
This was wonderful.
Thanks, Chinmay. Thank you all.